this reading from the Gospel of Mark that you've heard summarized. I think I will just finish halfway through today, since my focus will be on the first part of the text, and you can read the second part yourself if you like. Listen now for a word from God to the church this day. From there, Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syro-Phoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." And when she went home, she found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Please join me in a word of prayer. O Lord, uphold me, that I may uplift thee. Amen. Now, the book of James that you heard earlier is considered to be a book of advice for how Christians ought to live, which is confusing since Jesus himself seems to contradict its advice for today. The tongue is powerful, James says. It can bless with power, and it can also curse with deadly poison. That's why not many of you should become teachers, because the minute you open your mouth, it can go either way. Blessing or poisonous curse. When Rabbi Jesus opens his mouth today, it is more on the poisonous side. It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. He says to a worried mother who has come seeking healing for her daughter, who is possessed by an unclean spirit. He says to her, this healing is not for you because she is an outsider, not part of the Jewish people to whom he has been sent. Now, even if you grant that there is nothing philosophically wrong with Jesus understanding himself to be sent first to his own group, certainly there are nicer ways to say that to a worried mother other than calling her a dog. I mean, if someone came here seeking help and I said, you know the word, we don't serve non-members here, I'd be fired, probably defrocked, and for good reason. It is the opposite of the hospitality lessons that we're striving for, the ones all through the Hebrew Scriptures that Jesus himself would have learned as a child. Now, we could just rationalize it by saying that Jesus was having a bad day. Everybody has a bad day now and then. The text kind of sets it up to sound that way. He goes to the region of Tyre, which is outside of his usual turf. Maybe he's a little nervous. Or maybe he's really tired from the travel and the crowd since he enters a house and wants people to leave him alone. The Gentile woman probably knows this already. She's likely heard it from Jesus' followers outside the house. Nevertheless, she persisted. I guess there are some readers who might conclude that she had it coming. Yet I wonder if Mark's vision of the reign of God that is marked by generosity and hope and justice is actually better served by seeing Jesus as a little less than perfect. And I know this flies in the face of Orthodox teaching, not to mention the book of Hebrews that proclaims that Jesus was tested as we are, yet without sin. But what if being without sin doesn't have to be the same as being perfect? In fact, what if the idea of perfection itself, at least the way we understand perfection in our culture, meaning never making mistakes, what if that pursuit was more likely to lead us into sin in the first place? That is the conclusion that the Center for Community Organizations, COCO for short, came to a number of years ago when it published their report on characteristics of white supremacy culture inside of organizations. One of the reasons to attempt naming characteristics of white supremacy culture, they argue, is to point out how organizations that unconsciously use these characteristics as their norms and standards make it difficult, if not impossible, to open the door to other cultural norms and standards. What surprised me about the report when it first came out a number of years ago was reading that COCO had named perfectionism as one of the characteristics of white supremacy culture. They describe a perfectionist culture as one in which mistakes are seen as personal, reflecting badly on the person making them, as opposed to being seen for what they are, mistakes. In a perfectionist culture, there is little appreciation expressed for the work that others are doing, they write. When appreciation is expressed, it is often directed at those who already receive the most credit. In a perfectionist culture, it is more common to point out how a person or their work is inadequate. Moreover, it is common to talk to others about the inadequacies of a person or their work without ever talking directly to the person in question. In a perfectionist culture, making a mistake is confused with being a mistake. Doing wrong is confused with being wrong. There is little time, energy, or money put into reflecting as a group and identifying lessons learned that could improve practice. In other words, little or no learning from mistakes. And finally, in a perfectionist culture, there's a lot of splitting hairs and nitpicking. People bring up every imperfection in others' contributions, or find exceptions to generalized observations that may be offered. COCO offers a number of antidotes, what they call antidotes to a culture of perfectionism, including things like emphasizing a culture of appreciation, where we take time to ensure that people's work and efforts are valued. Asking people to include specific suggestions for how to do things differently when they offer critical feedback. And perhaps my favorite antidote is what they call developing a learning organization, where it is expected that everyone will make mistakes, and that those mistakes offer opportunities for growth. Such a learning organization fosters an environment where people can recognize that mistakes sometimes lead to positive results. What if Jesus already assumes that he is part of that kind of learning organization? Or that part of his mission is developing a group of followers who understand themselves to be part of something similar. A community of people setting out not to be perfect, but to develop a greater ability to learn from their failures. In fact, developing a body that expects transformation to come in the wake of most failures. Maybe failure isn't even a word we should use for most situations, since the mistake or shortcoming is often less important than what comes from it. In the story today, as you've heard, Jesus learns from this Gentile woman. He learns that her love for her daughter is not different from that of a mother in his own tradition. He learns that his healing is powerful beyond his own tribe. He learns that his mission can be expanded beyond what he originally thought. If that kind of learning is embarrassing to Jesus, he certainly doesn't show it. He's not embarrassed by the fact that he learned something new from a person who is probably of lesser standing than him. He's certainly not embarrassed that a woman outside of his faith teaches him something about the direction of his own. And while I know that a lot of scholars will bend over backwards to insist that Jesus knew exactly what he was doing before he was doing it, I think it's also important to ask, why do we always seem to attribute perfection to God, as though being perfect is somehow better than being open to change? Whose interest does it serve to insist that the godly are people who are in charge or all-knowing? Why would we insist that these characteristics are somehow more holy than being humble, open, listening, and willing to be changed? Maybe Jesus doesn't need to be the hero of every story in order for us to learn the kind of community that he is creating with his words and his actions. In fact, the real hero of the story is the Syrophoenician woman who doesn't take no for an answer even when she is insulted. Most of us, I think, when we get hurt, we withdraw or we try to hurt back. It's totally understandable, a very human thing. And yet, when our hurt guides us, we end up losing sight of what it is that we actually want or actually need. The hurt ends up hurting us beyond the initial wound. This Syrophoenician woman doesn't lose her focus. She wants healing for her daughter. An insult will not distract her from that goal. She refuses to take no from the one who is in a stronger position than her, offers a playful retort, and Jesus commends her for it. In fact, the primary characteristic that seems common to both the Syrophoenician woman and Jesus is their openness to possibility beyond the initial dead end that seems to be declared by Jesus. The woman stays open to the possibility that Jesus might be more gracious than his initial comment makes him out to be. And Jesus stays open to the possibility of learning more about his own mission from a person outside his tribe and faith. And it is their openness to greater possibility that leads to healing for this woman's daughter, and even greater healing that will come for others in the future as a result of Jesus' expanded understanding of who he is sent to serve. When I think about our church's history, It is that openness that has always led us to greater blessing. Openness to a Jew preaching in the pulpit all the way back in the early 1900s. Multiracial services in the 1930s. Openness to gay and lesbian people in the 70s and 80s. Openness to Salvadoran cries for justice in the 80s, to Native American testimonies in the 90s. Openness to the possibility that we might have a future on this corner in the 70s when middle-class white people were fleeing the city in droves. Openness to the possibility that we might even be able to grow on this corner. That openness did not come without some interpersonal wounds. The church is brought up on charges of heresy for having an unconverted Jew preaching in the pulpit. The Afro newspaper said it's great that Brown is having a Jew preach, but why not an African American preaching at Brown? Queer folks had to defend their identity over roundtable discussions that were not without a great deal of pain. And I've lost track of how many times we have hurt each other over questions of resources, where and how to spend them, or even what we do in worship or in mission. None of these encounters have been notable for their perfection. And our church was and is far from heroic. But that is the wonderful thing about hospitality encounters. They are rarely without discomfort and mistakes, some that are hurtful. And yet, when human beings are really open to the possibility that I might see something of God in you, and there may be something of God in me, transformation is always near. Maybe that's what Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman are teaching us with their encounter today. Getting things right the first time in Christian community isn't the main thing. It may be how we handle it when someone gets it wrong. Can you stay open to the possibility that God may not be finished with the encounter? That the blessing might just be in what happens on the other side of the mistake, or on the other side of the hurt.